"You will never be one of us," my sister-in-law sneered at every holiday dinner. She prided herself on protecting the pristine Kensington bloodline from gold diggers like me. But when my father-in-law suffered a sudden collapse, the hospital rushed a family tissue panel for an emergency transplant. The chief of medicine did not hand the results to his wife. He did not hand them to his son. He pulled me into a soundproof room and locked the door. "Your husband shares 0 genetic markers with his father," the doctor said. "But that is not the real reason I called you in here." The sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit slammed open. The rhythmic beep of the ventilator echoed down the sterile hallway. Before I could even reach the foot of my father-in-law Richard's bed, a hand shoved my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble. Maya, my husband's adopted older sister, stood between me and the monitors. She is a striking African-American woman who uses her sharp features and expensive designer wardrobe to intimidate anyone she deems beneath her. Right now, her dark eyes glared at me with pure contempt. "Get out of this room," Maya hissed. Her voice stayed low to avoid drawing the nurses, but the venom was palpable. "This is for real, family. You do not have a single drop of Kensington blood in your veins. You have no right to stand near him." I looked past her shoulder to my husband David. He stood near the window, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored slacks. We had been married for 3 years. 3 years of enduring his family's relentless subtle jabs about my working-class background. I waited for him to step forward. I waited for him to tell his sister to back off. David simply looked at the floor. "Just go wait in the cafeteria, Vanessa," he muttered. "Maya is right. We need to handle this ourselves." My chest tightened. The betrayal stung a cold, sharp slice right through my ribs. I adjusted my handbag strap, refusing to let them see my jaw clench. I turned toward the exit, preparing to walk away and let them play their roles. A clipboard smacked against the nurse's station counter. Dr. Harrison, the chief of critical care, stepped into the doorway, blocking my path. He did not spare a single glance for Maya or David. He pointed his pen straight at my chest. "Vanessa Kensington," the doctor stated. "I need a word with you in my office. Right now." Maya scoffed, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "Whatever you need to say about my father, you say it to us. She is just an in-law. She has 0 authority here." Dr. Harrison turned his head slowly. He leveled a cold, unblinking stare at Maya. "You need to step outside, both of you," the doctor instructed. "I will call security if you do not clear this hallway in 5 seconds." David opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer authority in the physician's tone made him freeze. The doctor ushered me across the hall into a private consultation room. The heavy door clicked shut, cutting off the noise of the monitors. Dr. Harrison dropped a thick file onto the glass table. "Richard needs a bone marrow transplant to survive this crisis. We ran a rapid tissue typing panel on your husband to check for a match." The doctor pushed a printed lab report toward me. I analyze financial data for a living, but the highlighted medical codes told a story that required no translation. "David is not a genetic match," I murmured, tracing the numbers with my index finger. "He is not even a partial match." Dr. Harrison corrected his voice, dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your husband shares 0 DNA with Richard Kensington. He is not that man's biological son." I stared at the paper. Patricia, my mother-in-law, had spent 32 years parading David around as the rightful heir to the Kensington real estate fortune. She had treated me like dirt, claiming my lineage was not good enough for her purebred son. It was all a lie, a 32-year-old multi-million-dollar fraud. "But that is not why I brought you in here, Vanessa." Dr. Harrison reached into the back of the file and pulled out a notarized legal document bearing the state seal. "Patricia and Maya have been harassing my staff for the last hour, trying to make medical decisions. They want to downgrade his life support." I frowned. "Patricia is his wife. She is his default proxy." "Not anymore." The doctor tapped the bottom of the page. The ink was fresh, dated exactly 28 days ago. "Richard revoked Patricia's status last month. He bypassed his wife, his adopted daughter, and the man he raised as his son. He designated you as his sole medical power of attorney. You are the only person who dictates whether that man lives or dies tonight." I stared at the medical proxy bearing my father-in-law's heavy, slanted signature. The crisp legal paper felt like an anchor, dragging my mind away from the sterile scent of the hospital and pulling me back to exactly 48 hours ago. The pieces of this twisted puzzle had been scattered right in front of me. I just needed the right cipher to read them. My name is Vanessa. I am 30 years old, and I work as a forensic auditor for a national healthcare network. Before I explain how a single hospital visit dismantled a billionaire real estate dynasty, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the truth always catches up to those who hide it. 2 nights ago, the Kensington family hosted their annual autumn charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. The ballroom hummed with the sound of clinking crystal and the shallow laughter of the city's wealthiest elites. The air felt heavy with the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. I wore a simple, unbranded black dress. I prefer to observe a room rather than command it. My sister-in-law, Maya, prefers to dominate every square inch of floor space she occupies. Maya wore a custom emerald silk gown that cost more than my annual salary. She glided over to our table, her eyes tracking the cheap fabric of my dress with practiced disdain. She held a goblet of dark Pinot Noir. Without breaking her stride, she tilted her wrist. A thick cascade of red wine splashed directly across my lap, soaking into the fabric and staining my skin underneath. It was not a clumsy stumble. It was a precise, calculated strike. Maya offered a slow, predatory smile. She dabbed her own pristine sleeve with a cocktail napkin. "You can wear all the designer knockoffs you want," Vanessa Maya whispered. Her tone was sweet, ensuring the neighboring tables heard nothing but polite conversation. "But you will never acquire the Kensington family DNA. A gold digger is just a gold digger no matter how hard you scrub." The irony of her statement was suffocating. Maya was adopted. She did not share a single strand of genetic material with the family she guarded so fiercely. But to overcompensate for her own deep-rooted insecurities, she appointed herself the gatekeeper of the Kensington bloodline, projecting her own fear of exclusion onto me. I turned to my husband. David sat right beside me. He watched the dark red liquid drip onto the marble floor. The man who stood at an altar and promised to protect me simply stared at his polished dress shoes. He picked up his own drink, cleared his throat, and muttered that I should go to the restroom and clean up before I embarrassed his family further. Patricia, my mother-in-law, let out a soft, breathy laugh. She hid her smug expression behind a linen napkin, her eyes glittering with cruel amusement. I did not shed a single tear. Crying requires valuing the opinions of the people hurting you. In my line of work as a forensic auditor, I deal in hard facts, deficits, and liabilities. This family was a liability. I picked up a dry cloth and pressed it against the stain, cataloging their reactions, the same way I track fraudulent corporate expenses. Right at that very moment, Patricia turned her attention away from my humiliation. She focused on her husband. Richard looked exhausted, his face drawn tight with the stress of entertaining. Patricia picked up a heavy crystal tumbler from the center of the table. "You look tense, darling," Patricia purred, her voice dripping with artificial affection. "Drink this. It will settle your nerves." Richard took the glass from his wife's hand. He downed the amber liquid in 2 long swallows. Within 30 seconds, the tumbler slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, sending shards of crystal flying across the dining room. Richard gasped loudly. His hands clawed at his own throat, then ripped at his chest. His chair tipped backward. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, his body convulsing in rigid spasms. White foam pooled at the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled back. The ballroom erupted into sheer chaos. Wealthy donors shrieked. Waiters dropped silver trays. The string quartet stopped playing in a jarring screech of violin strings. I dropped to my knees beside Richard, loosening his tie and shouting for someone to call emergency services. But as I checked his pulse, I glanced up. I noticed Patricia's reaction. She did not kneel beside the man she had been married to for 32 years. She did not scream for a doctor. She took 1 step back, smoothing the front of her designer gown, and looked down at his twitching body. Her face was a blank sheet of paper. There was no terror. There was only the cold, detached observation of someone watching a predictable experiment run its course. The memory snapped shut. I stood in Dr. Harrison's office, the harsh fluorescent hospital light buzzing above my head. The DNA test results sitting on the table merged with the memory of the charity gala. The puzzle pieces locked together with the chilling precision of a balanced ledger. I walked over to the interior window of the consultation room. Horizontal blinds covered the glass. I parted 2 slats with my index finger to observe the hallway outside. Patricia sat on a vinyl waiting room chair. Her husband was fighting for his last breaths 50 feet away. She was not praying. She was not pacing the halls in agony. She held her smartphone in both hands, her thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. Her posture was relaxed, her ankles crossed elegantly. She looked like a woman coordinating a luxury vacation, not a widow waiting for the final flatline. A few yards away, Maya had cornered a frazzled triage nurse near the supply closet. I could not hear the exact words through the soundproof glass, but I could read Maya's aggressive body language. She kept tapping the face of her diamond watch and pointing toward the intensive care doors. Then she reached into her designer handbag and shoved a glossy business card into the nurse's chest. I knew that specific business card. It belonged to the senior partners at the Kensington Estate law firm. Maya was not demanding medical updates. She was demanding the hospital's official protocol for the transfer of a deceased patient's personal effects. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Richard's collapse was not a tragedy of old age. It was a scheduled execution. Patricia and Maya were waiting for him to die. Patricia had handed him that drink. She had watched him fall. Now she was sitting in a hospital corridor, texting calmly, waiting for the monitor to stop beeping. David, the spineless coward I married, was either too blind to see the murder happening right in front of him, or he was silently complicit in exchange for a cut of the inheritance. I looked back down at the notarized medical proxy resting on Dr. Harrison's desk. Richard Kensington was a ruthless, brilliant titan of real estate. He trusted no one, and he analyzed every risk. He must have sensed the danger. He must have known his family was circling him like vultures smelling blood. He likely knew his wife was harboring a 3-decade-old secret about David's true parentage. He knew his adopted daughter was consumed by uncontrollable greed. He knew they were planning something fatal. Richard drafted this proxy exactly 28 days ago. He bypassed his wife. He bypassed the son he raised. He bypassed the daughter he adopted. He handed the keys to his survival to the one person in his orbit who operated purely on logic, data, and evidence. He gave the power to the forensic auditor. This piece of paper was not an administrative update. It was a distress signal. It was a loaded weapon Richard handed to me right before his own family pushed him off the cliff. I let the plastic blinds snap shut. I turned back to Dr. Harrison. The physician watched me with a guarded expression, waiting for my reaction. He expected me to break down. He expected tears, confusion, or denial. I picked up the medical proxy and folded it into precise thirds. I slid the document into the inner pocket of my blazer. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice. I felt my heartbeat slow down, settling into a steady, freezing rhythm. Do not let my mother-in-law near his intravenous lines. I instructed the doctor, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. And do not let my husband sign a single piece of hospital paperwork. I am the proxy. I dictate his care now. Dr. Harrison gave a curt, professional nod. What is your first directive, Vanessa? I looked at the heavy door separating us from the murderers waiting in the hallway. I adjusted my blazer, the fabric brushing against the hidden document that just shifted the balance of power in the Kensington Empire. We are going to run a very specific blood test, I said. I pushed the heavy wooden door of the consultation room open and stepped back out into the harsh fluorescent glare of the intensive care hallway. The air felt thin and sterile, smelling faintly of iodine and floor wax. I kept my face entirely blank. In my line of work, revealing your hand before the audit is finished is a fatal error. You do not let the targets know you have found the discrepancy in the ledger until you are ready to freeze their accounts. I took 2 steps toward the main corridor before my path was blocked. Patricia stepped out from the shadows near the visitor lounge. She did not walk like a woman whose husband was currently attached to life support machines. She moved with the predatory grace of a hunter cornering her prey. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a silk scarf, looking pristine and untouched by the night's events. She closed the distance between us, using her body to physically back me into the corner where the wall met the supply closet. There were no nurses nearby. The corridor was silent. Patricia reached into her designer handbag. Her manicured fingers produced a crisp, rectangular slip of paper. She held it up right at my eye level, ensuring the harsh overhead lights caught the dark ink. It was a cashier's check. The amount was written in bold, unmistakable numbers, $500,000. I looked at the check, then up into my mother-in-law's eyes. They were cold, flat, and devoid of any human empathy. Sign the medical proxy over to me, Patricia ordered. Her voice was a low, venomous whisper that barely disturbed the air. "Take this money. File for divorce from David by Friday. You will pack your cheap bags, you will leave this city, and you will never contact this family again." I stared at the slip of paper, $500,000 handed over in the shadow of a dying man's hospital room. For a brief second, the sheer audacity of the offer hung suspended in the quiet hallway. An ordinary person might have felt insulted. An ordinary person might have slapped the paper out of her hand or screamed for the hospital security guards. I did not scream. I processed the transaction. As a forensic auditor, I track fraudulent behavior for a living. I look for the panic hidden inside the numbers. A grieving wife does not carry a pre-written six-figure cashier's check in her purse on the night her husband suffers a random medical emergency. This was premeditated. Patricia had known this confrontation was coming. More importantly, she was terrified. I read the urgency vibrating beneath her calm exterior. Why the sudden rush to buy me off? Why the desperate need to reclaim the medical proxy at 2 a.m? The answer locked into place. If Patricia controlled the proxy, she controlled the ventilator. She needed the legal authority to walk into that intensive care unit and order the doctors to withdraw life support. She needed Richard dead tonight. She was terrified that if the sun rose, if the heavy sedatives wore off, Richard might open his eyes. He might regain consciousness and tell the authorities exactly what she had handed him to drink at the charity gala. "He is not going to survive the night, Vanessa." Patricia leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive floral perfume masking the clinical smell of the hospital. "Do not complicate things. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. The man is dying. Take the money and walk away while you still have a chance." Before I could respond, a shadow fell over us. Maya stepped up beside her adoptive mother. She stood several inches taller than me, using her height and her imposing physical presence to box me in further. She crossed her arms, her dark eyes glaring down at me with unbridled hostility. "You heard my mother!" Maya sneered, her voice laced with a dangerous edge. "You are out of your depth, little girl. If you do not sign that paper right now, I will personally unleash the entire corporate legal team on you. We will tie you up in so much litigation you will not be able to afford the bus ride back to whatever miserable neighborhood you crawled out of. We will ruin your career. We will bankrupt you. We will grind you into dust until you beg us to take that proxy back." Maya's threat echoed in the narrow hallway. She was trying to break my spirit using the only weapon she understood: power and intimidation. She truly believed that a woman with a normal job and a modest background would crumble under the weight of the Kensington Empire. She thought I would take the bribe and run like a frightened animal. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my gaze fixed on the check in Patricia's hand. Then the final piece of their toxic alliance stepped into view. David walked over from the waiting area. He did not look angry. He looked annoyed, as if my presence in this hospital was merely an administrative error he had to correct. The man who had shared my bed for 3 years, the man who had promised to stand by my side, looked at me with an expression of weary inconvenience. "Just sign the paper, Vanessa." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is family business. My family does not need you getting involved in things you do not understand. Just take the check and leave. It is the best deal you are ever going to get from us." I looked at my husband. I searched his face for any sign of grief for the man he called his father. I searched for any sign of loyalty to the woman he called his wife. I found nothing. He was an empty shell, a hollow vessel programmed to serve his mother's greed. He was willing to let them pull the plug on the man who raised him all to secure his slice of the inheritance. The betrayal was profound, but it did not break me. It liberated me. The final cord binding me to David snapped, dissolving into nothing. He was no longer my husband. He was an accomplice. The 3 of them stood in a semicircle blocking my exit, waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They expected compliance. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer. Patricia's eyes tracked my movement, a smug smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. She thought I was reaching for a pen. She thought she had won. I pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen with my thumb, opened the camera application, and raised the device. Before any of them could react, I pressed the button. The bright flash of the camera illuminated the dim hallway, capturing a crystal-clear, high-resolution image of Patricia holding the $500,000 check right in front of my face. The flash blinded them for a fraction of a second. Patricia gasped, stumbling backward and dropping her hand. Maya uncrossed her arms, her aggressive posture shattering into sudden confusion. David blinked, his mouth falling open. "What are you doing?" Patricia hissed, her voice losing its smooth veneer. "Give me that phone." I lowered the device. I tapped the screen once, uploading the image directly to my secure cloud server. I looked straight into my mother-in-law's eyes. My voice was calm, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Keep your money, Patricia." I stated the words, dropping like heavy stones onto the linoleum floor. Maya stepped forward, raising her hand as if to snatch the phone from my grip. I did not flinch. I held my ground, radiating a cold certainty that made her hesitate mid-step. Because under federal law, I continued maintaining unyielding eye contact with the woman who had just tried to buy my silence. If you pull his ventilator plug right now, it is not considered compassionate care. The police will call it murder. The color drained from Patricia's face. The smugness vanished, replaced by a sudden creeping terror. She looked at the smartphone in my hand, then at the intensive care doors, realizing in real time that her carefully constructed execution plan had just hit an impenetrable wall. "You think you can stop us?" Maya spat, though her voice shook. "You are nothing. I am the legal medical proxy," I replied, my tone razor sharp. "And I am a forensic auditor. I document everything. If either of you take us one step toward his room, or if his life support machines experience even a momentary glitch, I will hand this photograph and the proxy document straight to the authorities. You will not inherit a real estate empire. You will inherit a prison cell." David stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had spent 3 years believing I was submissive and weak. He was just now realizing he had married a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle his entire life. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I did not wait for their response. I stepped forward, forcing Patricia to move out of my way. I walked past them, my posture rigid, my focus clear. I had secured the perimeter. Now it was time to follow the money. The heavy wooden door of the intensive care unit clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the hallway. I handed the original notarized medical proxy to the floor manager, a seasoned trauma nurse named Sarah. "Effective immediately, place a strict security hold on this room," I instructed, keeping my voice level and unyielding. "Patricia, Maya, and David Kensington are barred from entry. If they try to force their way in, call hospital security. If they refuse to leave the corridor, call the police." Sarah examined the embossed state seal on the signature page. She looked through the glass partition at the 3 figures pacing outside, then gave a sharp professional nod. Through the reinforced window, I watched Maya turn to face the room, her face contorted into an ugly mask of rage. She slammed her open palm against the thick glass, her mouth moving in a string of shouted threats that the soundproofing reduced to dull, rhythmic thuds. David hovered behind her, pacing like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair in a display of frantic anxiety. Patricia simply stood still. She stared at me with dark, calculating eyes, realizing her access to her husband's life support had been officially severed. I reached out and pulled the privacy blinds shut with a sharp tug. The visual cord was cut. They were locked out, and I was locked in with the truth. The only sounds left in the room were the mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, tracking my father-in-law's fragile pulse. I pulled a sterile vinyl visitor chair right up to the edge of Richard's bed. I opened my briefcase, took out my laptop, and placed it on the rolling hospital tray table. A forensic auditor does not guess. A forensic auditor follows the paper trail. 6 months ago, Richard had asked me to look over a few minor discrepancies in the Kensington Corporation's quarterly filings. He handed me a read-only master key to the company's internal financial servers. He claimed it was a casual request, just a fresh set of eyes on routine paperwork. Looking at his pale, unconscious face resting against the hospital pillows, I realized that access code was a test. He suspected the rot inside his own empire, and he needed someone who lived by the numbers to find it. I connected to the secure hospital network, initiated my virtual private network, and bypassed the corporate firewall using Richard's administrative credentials. Rows of data populated my screen. Thousands of transactions, wire transfers, and offshore routing codes unspooled in the harsh blue light of the monitor. Numbers do not possess loyalty. They do not lie to protect a legacy. They simply exist as a permanent record of human behavior. I started with the most vulnerable asset pool, Richard's Executive Retirement Fund. Within 30 minutes of running custom sorting macros, the structural integrity of Maya's pristine reputation began to crumble. Maya prided herself on protecting the purity of the Kensington bloodline. She treated the family fortune like a sacred trust, constantly belittling my working-class roots. The ledger told a vastly different story. I tracked a series of recurring, automated wire transfers originating from the corporate pension accounts. The money was routed through a labyrinth of vendor payments, classified under vague consulting services and overseas property management fees. I isolated the routing numbers and ran them through a global corporate registry database. The funds funneled directly into 5 separate shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I pulled the incorporation documents for each one. Maya was listed as the primary beneficiary and sole managing director on all 5. Over the past 3 years, the woman who called me a gold digger had quietly embezzled over $4 million from her own adoptive father's retirement accounts. The theft was audacious, but Maya could not have bypassed the internal banking alerts alone. She needed an inside signatory. I cross-referenced the approval codes on the wire transfers. Every single fraudulent transaction bore the digital signature of the Vice President of Acquisitions, David. I ran a secondary trace on the outgoing disbursements from Maya's shell accounts. On the first of every month, 20% of the stolen funds were wired into a private, untraceable offshore account under David's name. My husband was not a passive bystander bullied by his sister. He was an active co-conspirator. He was collecting a hush fee to help drain his father's empire. The timeline provided the final chilling piece of the puzzle. I checked the corporate calendar. The annual independent shareholder audit was scheduled for the 28th of this month, barely 2 weeks away. External examiners would tear through these ledgers. The missing $4 million would trigger an immediate federal investigation. Maya and David were cornered. The only way to stop the audit and bury the embezzlement was a sudden tragic transition of power. They needed Richard dead before the accountants arrived. They needed control of the board to seal the financial records. A sharp buzz against the metal tray table broke my concentration. My smartphone screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. Text messages, missed calls, and social media alerts flooded the lock screen in a rapid, endless stream. I picked up the device and tapped a link forwarded by a concerned former colleague. It opened the Instagram application. Maya was broadcasting a live video to her 200,000 followers. She sat in the hospital waiting room looking disheveled and frantic. Her designer makeup was artfully smudged tears streaming down her cheeks in a masterful performance of public grief. This gold digger, this monster, has locked us out of my father's hospital room. Maya sobbed into the camera lens, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. Vanessa is holding a dying man hostage. She forged a medical document to isolate him from his real family. She is trying to extort us for millions while my father takes his last breaths. Please, everyone share this. Expose her. The view count skyrocketed in real time. The comment section became a rapid blur of vitriol. Strangers called for my arrest. Internet mobs demanded my home address. They threatened my safety, weaponized by a thief playing the victim card. Maya was utilizing the court of public opinion to destroy my reputation, hoping the external pressure would force me to surrender the proxy and flee the building. I watched her fake tears roll down the bright screen. I did not type a response in the chat. I did not issue a public denial on my own profile. Defending yourself against a lie only gives the lie more oxygen. I simply took a screen recording of her broadcast, saved the video file to my encrypted drive alongside the embezzlement records, and turned my phone face down on the table. Maya thought a viral video was leverage. She did not understand the battlefield she had just entered. A lie requires an audience to survive. The truth only requires a courtroom. I turned my attention back to the glowing spreadsheets, preparing the financial dossiers for the authorities. Let them scream in the digital void. I had numbers to finalize. The smartphone vibrated against the metal tray table, emitting a harsh mechanical hum. The caller ID displayed the name of my department head at the healthcare network, Gregory Thorne. I answered the call. I did not offer a greeting. Gregory did not offer one either. His voice was clipped, carrying the distinct cadence of a man reading a script prepared by a corporate legal department. Vanessa Gregory stated, "Human Resources sent an email to your personal account 5 minutes ago. Your employment with our firm is terminated effective immediately." He cited the morality clause in my contract. He mentioned the viral social media broadcast Maya had orchestrated. He used phrases like public relations crisis and protecting the corporate image. The company did not care about the truth. They cared about the shareholders. I was a liability, so I was being erased. "Process my severance package according to the executive tier guidelines," I replied. My tone held no tremor, no plea for understanding. "Mail the physical documents to my home address." I ended the call before Gregory could muster a response. The screen went dark, then instantly lit up again with a new text message. The sender was David. "You lost your job. You lost your reputation. You lost everything. Sign the proxy over to my mother right now, and I will let you walk away with a fraction of your dignity. Fight us, and you will end up in a jail cell or on the street." The walls of the intensive care unit were supposed to feel like a crushing vice. Maya and David had systematically stripped away my income, my public standing, and my safety net in less than an hour. They expected me to suffocate under the pressure. They expected me to surrender. I took a screenshot of David's extortion attempt, uploaded the image to my encrypted server, and set the phone face down on the table. The loss of my job was an administrative inconvenience. It did not alter the facts resting on the hospital bed in front of me. I turned my attention back to Richard. The ventilator pushed air into his lungs with a rhythmic, unfeeling hiss. I reviewed his physical symptoms from the charity gala: the sudden collapse, the severe rigidity in his limbs, the white foam pulling at his lips. The medical chart at the foot of his bed listed a severe ischemic stroke as the preliminary diagnosis. My training as a forensic auditor requires me to locate the missing variables in any official report. A stroke did not account for the specific nature of his convulsions. It did not account for the dark bruise discoloration pooling beneath his fingernails. The Kensington family had rushed him into this hospital, dictating the narrative to the triage team. They insisted it was a natural collapse. They pushed for immediate end-of-life protocols. They steered the physicians away from looking deeper. They had intentionally skipped a step in the diagnostic process. I stood up and pressed the call button above the bed. Dr. Harrison entered the room 2 minutes later, his stethoscope hanging around his neck. He looked fatigued, ready to deliver a standard update on a deteriorating patient. "I need a new blood draw," I instructed, handing him the clipboard. "I want a comprehensive heavy metal toxicology panel run immediately." Dr. Harrison frowned, crossing his arms. "Vanessa Richards suffered a catastrophic neurological event. A heavy metal panel is a specialized, time-consuming test. It is not standard protocol for a stroke patient. We need to focus on managing his organ failure. The diagnosis of a stroke is a theory based on a narrative provided by his wife," I replied, my voice slicing through the quiet room. "I am the legal medical proxy. I do not deal in theories. I require empirical data. Draw the blood and send it to the biochemistry lab on a priority rush." Dr. Harrison looked at the sheer resolve in my posture. He did not argue further. He signaled a phlebotomist who drew 3 vials of dark blood from Richard's central line. I watched the vials leave the room, knowing those small glass tubes held the truth Patricia was so desperate to bury. 4 hours passed. The digital clock on the wall shifted from 3 in the morning to 7. The hospital awoke around us. The muted sounds of the morning shift change drifted through the heavy doors. I did not sleep. I sat in the vinyl chair, my eyes tracking the steady rise and fall of Richard's chest, compiling the data points of the Kensington family syndicate in my mind. At exactly 7:14, the door clicked open. Dr. Harrison stepped inside. He did not look fatigued anymore. He looked horrified. He held a printed laboratory report in his hands, his knuckles gripping the paper so tightly his skin turned white. He locked the door behind him and walked over to the tray table. He set the report down, pushing it toward me. "You were right," Dr. Harrison said. His voice was a hollow, echoing shell. It was not a stroke. I looked down at the laboratory results. The document was a rigid grid of chemical markers and concentration levels, but one specific line was highlighted in stark, undeniable red ink: thallium. I read the concentration levels printed next to the element. The numbers were staggering. His blood toxicity is astronomical. Dr. Harrison continued tracing the line with a shaking finger. Thallium is a heavy metal. It is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It is a highly regulated toxin. The levels in his system are 10 times the lethal dose. He is experiencing acute heavy metal poisoning superimposed on months of chronic low-dose exposure. The physician stepped back, running a hand over his face. Someone has been poisoning him slowly for months, and they gave him an acute dose tonight to finish the job. The pieces of the puzzle collided in my mind, forming a picture of unparalleled depravity. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, summoning the memory of the charity gala, the crowded ballroom, the clinking crystal, Patricia standing beside her husband, her face a mask of artificial devotion. She had picked up the heavy tumbler of whiskey. She had handed it directly to Richard. "Drink this, it will settle your nerves," she had purred. 30 seconds later, Richard hit the marble floor. Patricia did not panic because she had poured the executioner's dose herself. The thallium explained his gradual decline over the past year. It explained the fatigue, the hair loss, and the subtle neurological tremors that Maya and Patricia had written off as the natural aging process of an overworked billionaire. The motive was crystal clear, solidifying with the cold logic of a balance sheet. Richard Kensington was a brilliant man. He had undoubtedly discovered the missing $4 million from his retirement fund. He had initiated a shadow audit tracing the money to Maya's offshore shell companies. And during that quiet investigation, he must have stumbled upon the 32-year-old lie regarding his own lineage. He discovered David was not his biological son. He discovered Patricia had trapped him in a fraudulent marriage. Richard was preparing to disinherit them all. He was preparing to send Maya to federal prison and leave Patricia destitute. Patricia, Maya, and David realized the empire was slipping from their grasp. They formed a syndicate of survival. Patricia provided the poison, executing a slow, untraceable murder that would mimic natural neurological decline. When Richard drafted the secret medical proxy, handing his life over to me, they realized he knew their plan. They panicked. Patricia delivered the lethal dose at the gala to silence him before he could contact the authorities or alter his final will. They needed him dead tonight. They needed the coroner to sign a death certificate listing a stroke as the cause of death. They needed me to surrender the proxy so they could pull the ventilator plug and erase the evidence of their crimes. I looked at the printed toxicology report. It was not just a medical document. It was a receipt for attempted murder. Dr. Harrison. I said, my voice echoing with freezing clarity. Do not enter these results into the General Electronic Health Record System. Keep this document strictly classified under my proxy authority. Implement a heavy metal detoxification protocol immediately. Start the Prussian blue antidote. Vanessa. Dr. Harrison whispered, his eyes wide with the realization of what was happening in his hospital. We are legally obligated to contact law enforcement. This is attempted homicide. We will contact the authorities. I replied, carefully folding the toxicology report and placing it into my briefcase right next to the embezzlement ledgers. But not the local police. The local police can be bribed with Kensington money. I am going to dismantle their entire syndicate, and I am going to do it on the federal level. I zipped the briefcase shut. David thought taking my job would break me. Maya thought a viral video would force my surrender. Patricia thought her poison was untraceable. They were playing a desperate game while I possessed the exact blueprint to wipe them off the board entirely. The reinforced double doors of the intensive care unit did not simply open. They were shoved apart with enough brute force to rattle the hinges. The security hold I had placed on the room shattered in an instant. Maya and David marched into the sterile space. They did not come alone. 2 individuals in sharp, predatory charcoal suits flanked them, exuding the distinct, arrogant aura of high-priced corporate fixers. A hospital security guard trailed behind the group, looking firmly at the linoleum floor, clearly having been bought off to look the other way. The illusion of a quiet hospital vigil vanished. This was a hostile corporate takeover executed over a dying man's hospital bed. David crossed the room in 3 long strides. He bypassed the monitors and the maze of intravenous lines connected to his father. He lunged straight for me. His hand shot out, clamping down on my wrist with a vicious, bruising grip. The man who usually avoided conflict at all costs now wielded his physical strength to intimidate me, his fingers digging into my skin. "What kind of game are you playing, Vanessa?" David snarled, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and desperation. You are holding my father hostage. Pull the ventilator plug right now. The doctors already said he is gone. This is what he would have wanted. Do not prolong his suffering for your sick power trip." I looked down at his hand gripping my wrist, then back up into his eyes. There was no grief in his expression. There was only the frantic terror of a thief realizing the vault timer was ticking down. Maya stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "We are done playing nice," she hissed. "You ignored our offers. You ignored the warnings. Now you are going to learn what happens when you cross this family." The female attorney, a woman with ice-cold blue eyes and a severe blonde bob, stepped up beside Maya. She did not introduce herself. She unclasped a leather portfolio and slapped a heavy multi-page legal document down right on top of Richard's blanket, inches from his motionless hand. "This is an emergency judicial injunction," the attorney stated, her voice a practiced monotone drone designed to bulldoze opposition. "Signed by a circuit court judge 20 minutes ago. It temporarily suspends your status as the medical proxy on the grounds of severe emotional distress and suspected financial extortion. Mrs. Patricia Kensington is reinstated as the sole decision-maker. You are legally ordered to vacate this premises immediately, or the guards will forcibly remove you." The room felt small, suffocating under the weight of their combined assault. They had cornered me. They had brought muscle. They had brought fabricated legal threats, and they were using the sheer volume of their aggression to isolate me entirely. A normal person would have crumbled under the threat of arrest. A normal person would have looked at the legal seal on the document and surrendered. I did not flinch. I yanked my arm back with a sharp, violent jerk, breaking David's grip. The sudden movement caught him off guard, making him stumble back a half step. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not open the camera this time. I opened the voice recorder application. I pressed the red circular icon. The timer began ticking on the screen, capturing the silence that suddenly fell over the group. "State your name and bar association number for the record counselor," I instructed, leveling a gaze at the female attorney that was as unyielding as a steel beam. The attorney blinked, her practiced drone faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me, you just presented a legal document authorizing the withdrawal of life support." I continued, my voice steady, projecting clearly into the microphone. "I want your name recorded before I explain the consequences of executing that fraudulent injunction." Maya scoffed, rolling her eyes. "She is bluffing. Ignore her. Just call the guards and throw her out." I did not look at Maya. I kept the phone pointed like a weapon. I locked eyes with David, the man who had just bruised my wrist. Let the record show that David Kensington and Maya Kensington are present in this room, actively attempting to force the removal of Richard Kensington's ventilator, I stated clearly. I paused, letting the silence stretch for 2 agonizing seconds, ensuring the gravity of my next words landed with maximum impact. "If any of you dare to touch that machine," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing lethal register, "or if you attempt to enforce that fake injunction to pull the plug, I will immediately submit the heavy metal toxicology report to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It was not a gradual change. It was a sudden, violent drop in atmospheric pressure. The smugness vanished from Maya's face, replaced by a rigid, wide-eyed stare. David's mouth opened slightly, his breath catching in his throat. I took a deliberate step forward, forcing David to retreat. "You did not account for a blood draw, did you, David?" I asked, keeping the phone raised. "The doctors found the thallium. They found the lethal dose Patricia handed him at the Gala. They found the chronic poisoning you all orchestrated for the last 6 months." The female attorney froze. The arrogance drained out of her posture. Lawyers deal in threats and civil litigation. They do not deal in accessories to premeditated murder. She looked at Maya, then at David, the realization dawning on her that she had been hired to facilitate an execution. "If that ventilator stops pumping air into his lungs," I continued, the steady rhythm of my voice, hammering the nails into their coffins, "it will not be categorized as a natural death following a stroke. It will be classified as a homicide. And this recording will serve as evidence that you, Maya and Patricia, conspired to murder the patriarch of this family to cover up the $4 million missing from his retirement fund." Maya let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The mention of the specific dollar amount shattered the last remnant of her composure. She realized the audit was already complete. I had found the offshore accounts. I had found the poison. I held every single thread of their conspiracy in my hands. The attorney slowly, carefully reached out and pulled the fake injunction off Richard's bed. She did not say a word. She did not argue legal precedent. She tucked the document back into her portfolio, took 3 deliberate steps backward, and slipped out the heavy wooden doors, abandoning her clients without a backward glance. The second corporate fixer followed her, instantly vanishing into the hallway. They were gone. The hired guns had fled, leaving Maya and David entirely exposed. David stared at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. He looked at the smartphone recording his panic, then at the ventilator keeping the evidence of their crime alive. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to intimidate a forensic auditor using brute force, ignoring the fact that I had already built an impenetrable fortress of data around his father. I tapped the red square on my screen, stopping the recording. I saved the file, the digital click echoing loudly in the silent room. Now, I said, pointing toward the exit, "Get out of my hospital room, before I decide to call the authorities right this second." Maya and David did not argue. They did not scream or threaten me. They turned and practically ran out the doors, their desperate retreat a silent admission of their absolute defeat. I had reversed the ambush, crushing their hostility with the cold, immovable weight of the truth. The retreat from the intensive care unit was a temporary surrender, not a capitulation. Maya Kensington did not build her identity around conceding defeat. Driven into a corner by the toxicology report and the looming threat of a murder charge, she resorted to the only strategy she had left. She initiated a scorched earth protocol. If they could not silence the witness, they would liquidate the empire and vanish before the authorities could freeze the assets. The retaliation began less than 12 hours after I threw them out of the hospital room. I was sitting by Richard's bedside reviewing the latest liver enzyme readouts when my smartphone buzzed. A notification flashed across the screen. My primary credit card had been declined for a recurring subscription charge. A minute later, a second notification arrived. My debit card was locked due to suspicious activity. I logged into my banking application. The joint checking account I shared with David, an account containing my own salary deposits alongside his, showed a balance of exactly $0. He had executed a sweeping wire transfer, draining the funds entirely. Before I could process the financial freeze, an email arrived in my personal inbox. It was a formal notice from the property management company of our luxury apartment building. The lease, which was solely in David's name to appease Patricia's desire for financial control, had been abruptly terminated. The email instructed me to vacate the premises immediately. Security had been notified to deny me entry. David had effectively locked me out of my finances and my home with a few keystrokes. I stepped out of the hospital room, instructing Nurse Sarah to maintain the strict security hold, and called for a rideshare service. The driver dropped me off outside the sleek, glass-fronted high-rise I had called home for 3 years. The rain had started to fall, a cold, relentless downpour that washed the city streets in a dull, metallic sheen. I walked up to the lobby entrance, bypassing the doorman, only to find my key fob deactivated. A security guard, a man I had exchanged pleasantries with every morning, stepped into my path. He looked deeply uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes. "Mr. Kensington left instructions, ma'am." The guard muttered, shifting his weight. "You are not allowed on the property. He had some boxes brought down to the loading dock for you." I walked around the side of the building to the service entrance. 2 cardboard boxes sat on the wet concrete soaked through by the driving rain. Inside were a few items of clothing, a pair of cheap shoes, and a framed photograph of my deceased mother. Everything of value, my jewelry, my professional wardrobe, my personal electronics had been kept inside. They had stripped me of my resources, leaving me standing in the rain with $50 in my pocket and a laptop bag slung over my shoulder. They expected the sudden violent plunge into poverty to break my resolve. They expected me to panic, to call David begging for access to my own money, trading the toxicology report for a warm bed and a hot meal. I picked up the damp cardboard boxes. I did not shed a tear over the lost designer clothes or the empty bank accounts. Material possessions are leverage, and I was about to deploy a far more destructive form of capital. I carried the boxes to the hospital parking structure. I had parked my modest, reliable sedan on the 4th level 3 days ago. The car was cold, smelling faintly of old coffee and damp upholstery. I loaded the boxes into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The rain drummed heavily against the roof of the car. The isolation was profound, a stark contrast to the billionaire dynasty I was currently at war with. But within the confines of that dark, freezing vehicle, I possessed total clarity. I opened my laptop, resting it against the steering wheel. I connected to a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot masking my IP address through a series of proxy servers. I was invisible, untraceable, and fully armed. I accessed the corporate intelligence feeds. The news confirmed my suspicions. Maya had not been idle while David was draining my bank accounts. She had utilized Richard's ongoing coma to trigger a continuity of operations clause within the Kensington Corporation bylaws. She had convened an emergency closed-door session of the board of directors. The press release was slick and professional, due to the sudden and severe health crisis incapacitating the founder, Richard Kensington. The board had voted unanimously to appoint David Kensington as acting chief executive officer. Maya retained her position as vice president, but she was pulling the strings. The true objective was hidden beneath the corporate jargon. The board had approved an emergency restructuring plan. Maya and David were granted the authority to execute the expedited sale of 3 of the corporation's most lucrative commercial properties. The transactions were designed to close within 48 hours, transferring hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid capital directly into their control. They were preparing to crash the company and flee the country with the salvage value. I watched the progress bar on my screen as I compiled the data files. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a hospital bed. This was a massive, coordinated financial crime executed on a corporate scale. I created a new secure email draft. I did not address it to the local police precinct. The Kensington family held too much influence over municipal authorities. A well-placed bribe could bury a toxicology report in an evidence locker for months. I needed a strike force that could not be bought, one that operated with devastating federal precision. I attached the first file. The certified DNA panel confirming David possessed 0 genetic ties to the Kensington bloodline, establishing the motive for the hostile takeover and the 32-year-old fraud perpetrated by Patricia. I attached the second file. The comprehensive forensic audit logs detailing the $4 million Maya had embezzled from the executive pension fund, complete with the routing numbers to her offshore shell companies and the corresponding hush payments deposited into David's secret accounts. I attached the third and most critical file. The heavy metal toxicology report, bearing Dr. Harrison's signature, confirming the lethal dose of thallium in Richard's bloodstream, accompanied by the audio recording of David and Maya attempting to force the removal of his life support to conceal the poisoning. I addressed the email to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White Collar Crime Division, copying the Enforcement Division of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. I set a scheduled delivery timer. The email was programmed to transmit automatically in exactly 48 hours. If they managed to kill me, if they managed to steal the laptop, or if they found a judge corrupt enough to silence me, the payload would still detonate. The evidence would bypass the local corruption and land directly on the desks of federal agents tasked with dismantling corporate syndicates. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark. The rain continued to batter the windshield. I leaned my head against the cold headrest, staring out into the dimly lit parking garage. Maya and David believed they had stripped me of my power by taking my money and my home. They did not realize they had simply removed the final constraints, keeping me from burning their empire to the ground. The counterstrike was armed. Now I just needed to walk into the lion's den and ensure the right people were watching when the explosion occurred. The Kensington family did not cancel their annual charity gala. That would have signaled panic. It would have projected weakness to the board of directors and the elite investors they were currently attempting to defraud. Instead, Patricia and Maya transformed the event into a masterclass of public manipulation. They needed the city's wealthy elite to see them as the grieving, stoic stewards of Richard's legacy, bravely carrying the torch while the patriarch fought for his life. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. The venue was a fortress of privilege guarded by hired security specifically instructed to deny me entry. They had frozen my accounts. They had thrown my belongings onto the street. They expected me to be huddled in my car, defeated and invisible. I did not sleep in the car that night. A forensic auditor always maintains a secondary undisclosed contingency fund. I had kept a secure unlinked account active since my university days, a habit formed by an inherent distrust of sudden wealth. The balance was modest compared to the Kensington fortune, but it was entirely sufficient to fund an execution. I checked into a boutique hotel near the financial district. I showered, washing away the scent of the hospital in the cold rain. I did not purchase a ball gown. A gown implies a desire to fit and a desire to be accepted by the society that had just watched me get covered in red wine a few days prior. I was not attending this gala as a guest. I was attending as the architect of their destruction. I purchased a tailored, stark white suit. The cut was razor-sharp, the fabric immaculate and unforgiving. It was the armor of a woman arriving to deliver a verdict, not a plea. I secured my hair into a tight, severe knot. I wore no jewelry, relying solely on the cold, predatory confidence radiating from my posture. I arrived at the Ritz-Carlton at 9 o'clock in the evening, precisely as the keynote speeches were scheduled to begin. The private security detail stationed at the ballroom entrance recognized me instantly. They stepped forward, their hands resting on their communication radios, preparing to physically block my path. I did not slow my pace. I held up a single crisp legal document, a federally mandated whistleblower protection order I had preemptively filed, effectively barring any private security firm from obstructing my movement in a public venue under threat of federal obstruction charges. The guards hesitated. In that fraction of a second, the heavy gilded doors of the ballroom swung open to accommodate a passing waiter. I stepped through the gap, bypassing the security detail entirely. The ballroom was a sea of black tuxedos and glittering jewels. The low murmur of wealthy conversations hummed beneath the soft lighting. At the far end of the room, on a raised stage framed by floral arrangements, Maya Kensington stood behind a crystal podium. She held a microphone, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical sorrow. "My father is a fighter," Maya told the crowd, her hand resting over her heart. "He built this empire from the ground up, and even now, as he faces this sudden tragic illness, his spirit guides us. We are carrying his vision forward. David and I will ensure that the Kensington legacy remains strong, secure and untarnished during this difficult transition." Patricia sat at the table of honor closest to the stage, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. David sat beside her, looking appropriately solemn, his posture projecting the image of the responsible heir stepping up to the plate. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. The stark white of my suit cut through the sea of dark formal wear like a spotlight. The conversations nearest the entrance died first. Then the silence rippled outward, spreading table by table, as the city's elite registered my presence. Heads turned. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The woman who had been publicly humiliated just days ago, the woman who was currently being dragged through the mud on social media, had arrived at the most exclusive event of the season, looking like an apex predator. Maya noticed the shift in the room's energy. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes tracking the movement in the crowd until they locked onto me. The mask of the grieving daughter slipped. Her face contorted into a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. The microphone picked up her sharp intake of breath. "Security!" Maya shrieked into the microphone, her voice cracking, abandoning all pretense of elegance. "Get her out of here. Remove that gold digger right now. She is trespassing." The desperate command echoed off the high ceilings. A few security guards scrambled from the perimeter, moving toward the center aisle. I did not break into a run. I did not raise my voice to argue with the woman screaming on the stage. I completely ignored her. I altered my trajectory, moving smoothly toward table number 1. This was not the family table. This was the table reserved for the heavyweights, the senior members of the board of directors, the principal investors holding the largest blocks of Kensington Corporation stock, the individuals who actually possessed the power to freeze the emergency asset liquidation Maya and David were attempting to push through. I reached the table before the security guards could intercept me. The chairman of the board, an older man with silver hair and a notoriously ruthless reputation, looked up at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. I did not offer a greeting. I reached into the inner pocket of my pristine white blazer. I withdrew 5 thick crimson envelopes. The bright red paper was impossible to ignore against the white linen tablecloth. I placed one envelope directly in front of the chairman and distributed the remaining 4 to the other key investors seated around him. The envelopes contained the curated highlights of the forensic audit, the offshore routing numbers, the $4 million drained from the executive pension fund, the wire transfer receipts bearing David's authorization codes. It was the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb condensed into a few pages of undeniable data. I did not shout accusations. I did not create a scene for the rest of the ballroom to witness. I maintained absolute chilling composure. "Enjoy your dinner, gentlemen," I said, my voice low, polite, and terrifyingly calm. "I suggest you review those appetizers before you approve any expedited property sales tomorrow morning." I offered a small, razor-sharp smile, a precise mirror of the smile Maya had given me before pouring wine on my dress. I turned on my heel, the white fabric of my suit catching the chandelier light. The security guards had formed a perimeter ready to grab my arms. I simply walked right through them, my posture radiating an authority they did not dare challenge. Maya was still gripping the microphone on the stage, her mouth opening and closing, unable to form a coherent sentence. Patricia had half risen from her chair, staring at the red envelopes resting on the investor's table with wide, terrified eyes. David looked physically sick, his complexion turning a sickly shade of gray. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving the heavy doors open behind me. I did not look back. I did not need to see the explosion to know the bomb had detonated. I could hear the immediate frantic rustle of paper as the board members tore open the red envelopes, followed by the deafening silence of an empire, realizing it had been hollowed out from the inside. The heavy gilded doors of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom clicked shut behind me, muting the immediate chaos. I did not stand in the hallway to gloat. A forensic auditor knows that delivering the evidence is only the first phase. The true devastation occurs in the aftermath, when the numbers force the targets to confront their own ruin. I walked briskly through the opulent lobby, exiting into the cool night air, leaving the Kensington family to face the detonation. Inside the ballroom, the carefully curated illusion of the grieving unified dynasty evaporated in a matter of seconds. The chairman of the board, a man named Arthur Sterling, possessed a reputation for ruthless efficiency. I did not care about family drama or socialite gossip. He cared about the integrity of his investments. He tore open the heavy crimson envelope the moment I turned my back. The first page was a high-resolution printout of the offshore routing codes linking the corporate pension accounts directly to Maya's shell companies in the Cayman Islands. The second page was the ledger confirming the $4 million deficit. The third page was a copy of the wire transfer authorizations bearing David's digital signature. Arthur did not gasp. He did not shout. He simply stopped breathing for 2 full seconds. The color drained from his face, replaced by a cold, murderous fury. He slammed the documents down onto the white linen tablecloth, rattling the fine crystal wine glasses. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Maya, who was still standing frozen behind the crystal podium on the stage. The other major investors around the table had opened their respective envelopes. A collective harsh murmur rippled through the group. The realization hit them simultaneously. The emergency board meeting Maya had convened earlier that day, the desperate push to liquidate the prime commercial real estate assets. It was not a strategy to save the company during a medical crisis. It was a panicked attempt to cash out and flee before the annual audit discovered the missing $4 million. Arthur Sterling did not wait for Maya to offer an explanation. He pulled his smartphone from the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He bypassed the standard corporate channels and dialed the chief compliance officer directly. "Freeze everything." Arthur commanded, his voice a low, gravelly bark that carried to the nearby tables. "Suspend David Kensington's executive credentials. Revoke Maya Kensington's access to all corporate accounts. Halt the pending property sales immediately. If a single dollar moves out of this company before morning, I will personally see you indicted for negligence." Maya heard the command from the stage. The microphone picked up her sharp, terrified intake of breath. The charity gala designed to cement her status as the savior of the empire had instantly transformed into a public execution of her career. The wealthy donors sitting at the surrounding tables began to whisper frantically, realizing they were witnessing a monumental corporate collapse in real time. Patricia, sitting at the table of honor, recognized the catastrophic shift in power. Her husband was lying in a hospital bed with a lethal dose of thallium in his veins, a dose she had administered. Her adopted daughter had just been exposed as an embezzler in front of the board of directors. Her biological son was implicated in the fraud. The empire was not just slipping away, it was actively crashing down around them. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized Patricia. She grabbed her designer clutch and practically sprinted out of the ballroom, ignoring the stares of the confused guests. She rushed into a secluded alcove near the restrooms, her manicured fingers trembling violently as she unlocked her phone. She bypassed her usual contacts and dialed a number she had kept hidden for over 3 decades. She called Marcus Vance, a wealthy venture capitalist and the biological father of her son David, the man she had cuckolded Richard Kensington with 32 years ago. Marcus, Patricia hissed into the receiver, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "I need cash. I need access to a private jet tonight. The board just froze the accounts. They know about the money. They are going to find out about everything. I need to get out of the country before the authorities get involved." The line was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Then a cold, detached voice responded. "I do not know what you are talking about," Patricia Marcus replied smoothly, ensuring his own plausible deniability. "We have not spoken in years. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. Patricia stared at the phone, the realization sinking in that her safety net had just been cut. Marcus was not going to risk his own reputation to save a sinking ship. She was entirely on her own. Back in the main lobby, the pristine facade of the Kensington family shattered into violent, ugly infighting. Maya had fled the stage, dragging David out of the ballroom before the board members could confront them physically. They burst through the lobby doors, their panic escalating into outright hostility. Maya spun around, her custom emerald gown swirling around her legs, and slapped David hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed in the cavernous marble-floored space, startling a passing bellhop. "You useless, spineless coward!" Maya shrieked, her composure completely eradicated. "You were supposed to control your wife. You told me she was weak. You told me she would take the money and run. She just handed the board a roadmap to my offshore accounts. You ruined everything." David stumbled back, holding a hand to his stinging cheek. The sheer pressure of the situation snapped his usual subservience. He shoved Maya away, his face contorting with rage. "Do not blame this on me," David yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You got greedy, you got sloppy with the wire transfers, and you let Patricia handle the poison. She gave him too much at the gala. It was too obvious. If he had just died quietly in his sleep at home, Vanessa would never have demanded the toxicology report. You two arrogant fools dragged me into a murder plot, and now we are all going to prison." The alliance of convenience, built entirely on shared greed and a mutual disdain for anyone outside their toxic circle, disintegrated the moment the money vanished. They were no longer a unified front protecting a legacy. They were cornered animals viciously turning on each other in a desperate bid for self-preservation. Maya pointed a shaking finger at David, her chest heaving. "I am not going down for this alone. If the board presses charges, I will tell them you authorized every single transfer. I will hand them your offshore routing numbers myself. You do that, and I will tell the police exactly who handed my father that poisoned whiskey." David shot back, his eyes wide with frantic terror. "I will testify against both of you to save myself." They stood in the opulent lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, screaming accusations at each other, oblivious to the hotel staff watching them with thinly veiled horror. The Kensington Empire had not just been exposed, it had imploded. The silent, meticulous execution I had orchestrated through the red envelopes had triggered a chain reaction they could not stop. The dominoes were falling, crushing each other on the way down. The morning sun pierced the horizontal blinds of the intensive care unit, casting sharp geometric shadows across the sterile linoleum floor. The frantic, chaotic energy of the previous night had settled into a cold, clinical routine. I sat in the vinyl visitor chair beside my father-in-law's bed. The intravenous lines hummed, delivering the Prussian blue detoxification protocol directly into Richard's bloodstream. The cardiac monitor displayed a steady, reassuring rhythm. The heavy metal was being purged from his system. I did not wear the pristine white suit from the charity gala. I wore a crisp navy blouse and tailored slacks, the uniform of a woman preparing for a standard day at the office. My laptop rested on the tray table, processing the final data packets for the federal authorities. The heavy wooden door of the hospital room clicked open. David walked inside. He did not bring private security. He did not bring corporate fixers. He came alone and he looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck, only to realize he was stranded on a deserted island. His expensive tuxedo trousers were deeply wrinkled. He had discarded his jacket and tie, and the top 3 buttons of his dress shirt hung open. Dark bruised circles framed his bloodshot eyes. The arrogant, entitled heir who had mocked my working-class roots just days ago had evaporated. He closed the door quietly, ensuring it latched. He stood at the foot of Richard's bed, staring at me with a desperate, hollow expression. The sudden shift in his demeanor was jarring, a 180-degree pivot from the man who had ordered my belongings thrown onto the wet pavement. David took 2 hesitant steps forward. His legs seemed to give out beneath him. He dropped to his knees, the impact echoing dull and heavy against the hard linoleum floor. He crawled the last few feet, closing the distance until he was kneeling directly beside my chair. He reached out with trembling hands, grasping the fabric of my slacks. Tears spilled over his lower eyelids, tracking through the faint stubble on his cheeks. He began to weep, his chest heaving with loud, pathetic sobs. "Vanessa, please." David choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of his own panic. "My wife, I was wrong. I was so wrong. You have to listen to me." Maya forced my hand. She orchestrated the wire transfers. She threatened to cut me out of the company if I did not sign those authorization codes. I was just following her directives to protect our future. I looked down at the top of his head. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I simply observed the mechanics of a coward attempting to bargain his way out of a trap. "We can fix this, Vanessa." David pleaded, tilting his head up to meet my gaze. His eyes were wide, begging for a lifeline. "You have the access codes. You can retract the emails to the board of directors. You can delete the audit files. We do not need the Kensington Empire. We can take the offshore money. The $4 million is sitting in untraceable accounts. That money is enough for us to live comfortably forever. We can leave this city today. We can start over, just you and me." A chill settled over the room. The sheer, breathtaking cowardice of his proposal hung suspended in the air. He was kneeling beside the bed of the man his mother had poisoned, offering to share the money he had embezzled from that very man's retirement fund, and presenting it to me as a romantic escape. I looked at the man, grasping my knees. I remembered the freezing, relentless rain from 2 nights ago. I remembered sitting in the dark cabin of my sedan, locked out of my own bank accounts. My key fob deactivated my possessions, dumped on the loading dock like garbage. He had orchestrated my financial ruin without a second thought. Now he expected me to act as his shield. I reached into the leather briefcase resting by my feet. I bypassed the financial ledgers and the toxicology reports. I extracted a single sheet of paper enclosed in a plastic protective sleeve. I did not hand the document to him. I dropped it. The paper fluttered through the air and landed flat on the linoleum floor right between David's knees. David's desperate sobbing hitched. He looked down, his tear-filled eyes tracking the bold black text printed across the top of the laboratory header. He recognized the emblem of the hospital's genetic testing facility. His gaze dragged down the page, scanning the rigid columns of medical coding, the allele sequences, and the final highlighted conclusion at the bottom. Probability of paternity 0%. The silence in the intensive care unit became absolute. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator seemed to fade into the background. David stopped crying. His hands slowly released their grip on my slacks. He rocked back on his heels, his mouth hanging slightly open. He read the numbers again, his brain struggling to process the biological impossibility staring back at him. "You do not possess a single drop of Kensington blood, David," I stated, my voice dropping to a freezing, razor-sharp register. "Your mother had an affair 32 years ago. You are not a wealthy heir. You are merely a tool she used to mine for gold over the past 3 decades. David stared at the floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. The foundation of his entire existence, the elite status he had weaponized against me from the day we met, was a fabrication. He was not a prince of a real estate dynasty. He was an illegitimate pawn in Patricia's long con. I leaned forward in my chair, ensuring every word carved a permanent mark into his fractured ego. "You mocked my upbringing. You told me I did not belong in your elite circle," I whispered, delivering the final verdict. "But I earned my place through intellect and labor. You were handed a stolen crown, and I will never be complicit with a fraud." The psychological collapse was instantaneous. The sorrow and the desperate begging vanished from David's face. When a narcissist loses their false identity, the resulting void is instantly filled with raw, unfiltered rage. David let out a guttural, animalistic sound. He lunged upward from his knees, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. The illusion of the pleading husband died, replaced by a cornered predator seeking to destroy the source of his humiliation. He hurled his body across the narrow space between us, his hands hooking like claws aiming straight for my throat to silence me and rip the briefcase from my grasp. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to block his strike. I remained perfectly still in my chair. Before David's outstretched fingers could brush the collar of my blouse, the door to the private ensuite bathroom swung open with explosive force. Two individuals in unassuming plain clothes stepped out of the shadows. They were not hospital security guards. They did not wear badges on their chests. They moved with the swift, kinetic precision of tactical operatives who had spent the last hour waiting in total silence for their target to incriminate himself. The lead agent grabbed the back of David's dress shirt and the collar of his undershirt in one fluid motion. He yanked David backward, halting his momentum midair. The second agent swept David's legs out from under him with a brutal, calculated kick to the back of his knees. David hit the linoleum floor face first with a sickening thud. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp gasp. Before he could process the ambush, a heavy knee pressed down into the center of his spine, pinning him flat against the tiles. His arms were wrenched behind his back. The distinct metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed sharply across the room, locking his wrists together in a rigid bind. David Kensington, the agent, stated his voice a flat, authoritative bark. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal embezzlement, and accessory to attempted homicide." David lay pinned to the floor, his cheek pressed against the cold tiles right next to the DNA test that had just erased his identity. He twisted his neck, straining to look up at me from his compromised position. Panic and betrayal waged war in his widened eyes. He realized the entire morning had been a meticulously constructed trap. I had not been sitting alone by his father's bedside. I had invited the federal authorities to listen to his confession. I picked up the plastic sleeve containing the DNA results from the floor, wiping a speck of dust from the cover. I slid it neatly back into my briefcase. I looked down at the man thrashing weakly against the restraints. "I told you I was sending the files to the authorities, David." I said, my tone as casual as a weather report. A forensic auditor never bluffs. The agents hauled him to his feet, ignoring his frantic protests. They marched the ruined heir out of the hospital room, leaving the air clean and the ledger perfectly balanced. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, cutting off David's frantic protests as the federal agents hauled him down the corridor. The intensive care unit fell back into a profound, heavy silence. The immediate threat had been neutralized, leaving behind a stark stillness, broken only by the mechanical rhythm of the life support equipment. I remained seated in the vinyl visitor chair. I smoothed the lapel of my navy blouse, waiting for my adrenaline to recede. I needed a clear, unclouded mind for the next phase of the operation. Then the ambient noise in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible. The steady, measured hiss of the mechanical ventilator hitched. The machine pushed air into the breathing tube, but a new, uneven resistance fought back against the pressure. The cardiac monitor beeped, the tempo increasing from a slow, sedated crawl to a rapid, erratic flutter. I stood up and moved closer to the head of the bed. Richard Kensington's eyelids twitched. His hands resting limply on the sterile white blanket flexed slightly. The deep, bruised discoloration pooling beneath his fingernails remained visible, a lingering signature of the heavy metal toxicity, but the unnatural rigidity in his limbs had softened. The Prussian blue detoxification protocol, combined with the aggressive renal flushing I had mandated upon discovering the thallium, had effectively halted the poison's progression. The chemical siege was lifting. I leaned over the bed rails, maintaining a professional distance. His eyes slowly fluttered open. They were glassy and unfocused at first, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. He blinked repeatedly, his pupils dilating as his brain struggled to process the harsh overhead light and the restrictive sensation of the intubation tube resting in his throat. His gaze tracked downward, eventually locking onto my face. The confusion in his eyes slowly crystallized into recognition. He realized he was in a hospital room. He realized the woman standing vigil beside him was not his wife of 32 years. She was not the daughter he had adopted. She was the forensic auditor his family viewed with such intense disdain. He attempted to speak, but the plastic tube blocked his vocal cords. He let out a frustrated, muffled groan, his hands gripping the blanket. I pressed the call button above his head. Dr. Harrison arrived within seconds, accompanied by a respiratory therapist. They quickly assessed Richard's vitals, noting his regained consciousness and his ability to breathe independently over the machine's support. With swift, practiced efficiency, the therapist removed the endotracheal tube, extracting the plastic airway and allowing Richard to draw his first unassisted breath in nearly 4 days. Richard coughed violently, his throat raw and raspy. He reached up, grasping the edge of the metal bed rail to steady himself. He looked at Dr. Harrison, then his gaze slid back to me, an unspoken question burning in his eyes. Dr. Harrison offered a brief clinical update regarding the detoxification progress, then tactfully exited the room, leaving us alone to navigate the fallout. Richard cleared his throat, the sound dry and grating. His voice was a weak, gravelly whisper, a shadow of the booming baritone that usually commanded boardrooms. "How long?" Richard rasped his chest, heaving with the effort of speaking. 4 days. I replied, my tone neutral and informative. He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the lost time. He swallowed hard, grimacing at the pain in his throat. "Patricia," he asked. The single word hung heavily in the air, laden with an unspoken dread. I did not offer platitudes. I did not attempt to soften the impact of the reality he was waking up to. A forensic auditor presents the findings directly. You do not cushion the blow when the foundation of a building is compromised. I reached into my leather briefcase. I extracted the 3 primary documents that composed the indictment of his family. I placed the stack neatly onto the center of his chest, right over his hospital gown. "Good morning, Richard," I stated, ensuring my voice carried clearly over the hum of the remaining medical equipment. He looked down at the documents resting on his chest, then back up at my impassive face. He did not ask what they were. He knew my profession. He knew I dealt solely in irrefutable proof. "Patricia poisoned you." I began initiating the disclosure protocol. She administered a lethal dose of thallium via a tumbler of whiskey during the charity gala. We detected the heavy metal during a comprehensive toxicology sweep and initiated an emergency detoxification flush. She intended for you to suffer a fatal ischemic stroke to halt an impending internal audit. Richard stared at the ceiling, his jaw muscles clenching tightly. The revelation of his wife's murder attempt did not elicit a gasp of shock. It landed with the heavy, sickening thud of a long-held suspicion finally confirmed by hard data. I pointed to the top document resting on his chest. "That is a certified genetic testing panel completed by the hospital laboratory upon your admission." I continued, moving to the next critical vulnerability. "David shares 0 genetic markers with you. Patricia engaged in an extramarital affair over 3 decades ago. David is not your biological son. He is a financial instrument she utilized to secure her position within this empire." Richard's breathing hitched. His hands curled into tight fists against the blanket. A single jagged tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracking slowly down his pale, weathered cheek. He had built his entire life around the concept of legacy. He had accumulated wealth, power, and properties to pass down to an heir he believed was his own flesh and blood. 32 years of paternal pride, 32 years of mentoring and grooming a successor evaporated in the span of 3 sentences. The devastation was absolute. I did not pause to allow the grief to settle. The briefing was not complete. "The second document is a forensic audit log of your executive retirement accounts," I stated, directing his attention to the financial data. Maya utilized her administrative access to establish 5 separate offshore shell companies. Over the past 3 years, she has systematically embezzled $4.2 million from your pension fund. She facilitated the theft by paying David a 20% silent partner fee to authorize the fraudulent wire transfers. Richard squeezed his eyes shut. A deep, shuddering groan tore from his throat. The empire he had constructed with ruthless efficiency had been hollowed out from the inside by the very people he had trusted to protect it. His wife had attempted to execute him. His son was a biological fraud and a willing accomplice to theft. His adopted daughter was a common embezzler. The titan of real estate, a man who had broken rival corporations and bent city councils to his will, looked incredibly small and fragile lying in the hospital bed. He had spent his entire life analyzing market risks and outmaneuvering competitors entirely blind to the predators sharing his dining table. He lay in silence for several minutes, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminating the sudden profound aging etched into his features. The monitors beeped steadily, recording the vital signs of a man whose entire reality had just been dismantled. Finally, Richard slowly opened his eyes. The profound sorrow lingered, but a new hardening resolve began to solidify beneath it. He turned his head on the pillow, looking directly at me. He studied my face, perhaps truly seeing the woman his family had mocked and belittled for 3 years. He saw the pristine navy blouse, the unwavering posture, the total absence of emotional manipulation. He recognized the strength required to stand alone against a billionaire syndicate and secure the perimeter while he lay defenseless. "You saved my life," Richard whispered, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of the admission. I looked at the man who had largely ignored my existence, the man who had allowed his wife and children to treat me with open contempt. I felt no urge to demand an apology for his past indifference. I did not require his gratitude to validate my actions. I reached out and adjusted the corner of the financial dossier resting on his chest, aligning the edges perfectly. I simply balanced the ledger. I replied, my tone remaining cool, professional, and entirely factual. "The numbers do not lie, Richard, and I do not allow discrepancies to remain unresolved." The fragile peace within the intensive care unit lasted for precisely 36 hours. Richard Kensington utilized that time to absorb the devastating reality of his dismantled dynasty. He reviewed the financial ledgers tracing the path of Maya's embezzlement with a cold, terrifying focus. He scrutinized the DNA report, the absolute biological proof of Patricia's 32-year deception. He did not weep again. The initial shock had rapidly crystallized into a rigid, calculating fury. He was no longer a victim recovering from poison. He was a billionaire patriarch preparing for war. I remained stationed in the vinyl visitor chair, transforming the hospital tray table into a mobile command center. The federal authorities had acknowledged receipt of my encrypted data packets, and the wheels of justice were slowly beginning to turn. However, a cornered animal is exceptionally dangerous, and Maya Kensington was entirely out of options. The public implosion at the Ritz-Carlton had severed her access to the corporate accounts. Her desperate attempt to liquidate the real estate assets had been frozen by the board of directors. Her brother had vanished, apprehended by plainclothes agents right outside this very room. She was rapidly losing control of the narrative, but she still possessed one critical piece of leverage, or so she believed. Maya did not know her father was awake. She assumed he was still comatose, relying on the ventilator, a silent hostage she could exploit to force my hand. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit did not simply open. They were breached. Maya Kensington stormed into the sterile hallway, moving with the chaotic, frantic energy of a woman executing a desperate final maneuver. She was not flanked by high-priced corporate fixers this time. She led a team of 4 private medical transport technicians, individuals clad in generic scrubs, pushing a specialized mobile intensive care stretcher. They bypassed the nurses' station, ignoring the shouted protests of the floor manager. Maya marched directly toward Richard's room, her heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum. She carried a thick manila folder, clutching it to her chest like a shield. She was attempting a forcible medical extraction planning to physically remove Richard from the hospital premises and transfer him to a private facility where she could dictate his care and restrict my access. She shoved the door to Richard's room open, the handle banging loudly against the wall. Maya immediately launched into her performance, the volume of her voice calibrated to ensure the transport team and any lingering nurses witnessed her filial devotion. "Daddy, I am here," Maya sobbed, her voice trembling with artificial hysteria. "I am getting you out of this terrible place. I am taking you away from this wicked witch who has been holding you hostage. We have a private plane waiting. We are going to get you the best care in the world." She stepped fully into the room, her eyes focused on the medical monitors, signaling the transport technicians to bring the stretcher inside. She did not immediately look at the bed. She expected to see a motionless figure entangled in tubes and wires, a silent prop in her desperate rescue narrative. Maya finally lowered her gaze, turning her attention to the man she intended to abduct. The performance died instantly, the artificial sobs caught in her throat transforming into a strangled, choking sound. Richard Kensington was not lying flat, incapacitated by a coma. He was sitting upright, propped against a stack of pillows. The ventilator tube was gone, replaced by a simple nasal cannula, delivering a steady flow of oxygen. The pallor of impending death had receded, revealing the sharp, hawkish features of a man who had spent 40 years crushing his enemies. He was looking directly at her. His eyes, clear and blazing with a cold, unyielding fury, were sharp as a razor. The profound arrogance that defined Maya Kensington, the entitlement that fueled her embezzlement, and her relentless cruelty was extinguished in a fraction of a millisecond. The sudden realization that her victim was fully conscious and staring right through her shattered her carefully constructed facade. Maya stumbled backward. Her custom designer handbag slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The manila folder containing the fabricated transfer orders spilled open, scattering papers across the linoleum. She raised her hands defensively, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to formulate a coherent sentence. "Daddy," Maya stammered, her voice a reedy, pathetic whisper. You are awake. I thought the doctors said you thought the poison had finished the job." Richard interrupted, his voice rough and gravelly, yet vibrating with an unmistakable lethal authority. The transport technicians, sensing they had walked into a volatile and potentially illegal situation, immediately backed out of the room, abandoning the mobile stretcher in the hallway. They wanted no part of a billionaire family dispute. Maya stood frozen, entirely isolated in the center of the room. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape route, but I was standing near the door, blocking her exit. She looked back at Richard, her face pale, the realization dawning that she had brought a transport team to abduct a man who now possessed the financial ledgers detailing her $4 million theft. "I can explain," Maya pleaded, taking a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped together in a frantic gesture of supplication. "The money, it was an investment strategy. I was trying to protect the assets during your illness. Vanessa is manipulating the data. She altered the records to frame me." Richard did not raise his voice. He did not shout or hurl insults. He simply let the silence stretch, forcing Maya to listen to the hollow, echoing sound of her own lies. He reached over to the bedside table and picked up the printed forensic audit report I had prepared. He did not open it. He simply held it in his hand, a physical manifestation of her betrayal. "You always prided yourself on protecting the Kensington bloodline, Maya." Richard stated, his tone dripping with freezing contempt. "You spent years mocking Vanessa. You claimed she lacked the pedigree to sit at our table. You declared she would never truly fit into this family." Maya swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, desperately hoping he was validating her elitist gatekeeping. "Yes, Daddy, I was only trying to protect you from her." Richard leaned forward slightly, the hospital gown shifting against his chest. He locked his hawkish gaze onto his adopted daughter, delivering the final, devastating verdict. "You were entirely correct, Maya." Richard rasped the words, striking with the precision of a sniper's bullet. "Vanessa will never belong in this family. Because this family is far too corrupt, too greedy, and too fundamentally rotten to deserve her. She possesses a level of integrity and intellect that you could not achieve in 10 lifetimes. Maya flinched physically, the words landing like a physical blow. The patriarch she had manipulated, the man she had stolen from, while claiming to protect his legacy, had just elevated the working-class forensic auditor above her. The ultimate rejection was not financial. It was the complete, total invalidation of her worth. "You are no longer a Kensington," Richard declared, dropping the audit report onto the blanket. "Your access to the corporate accounts has been permanently severed. Your trust fund is dissolved. My legal team is currently cooperating with the federal authorities regarding your embezzlement. But Daddy, I am your daughter." Maya shrieked, panic clawing at her throat as the reality of her impending arrest materialized. "I have no daughter," Richard replied, his face a mask of absolute unfeeling stone. "And I strongly suggest you contact a criminal defense attorney immediately. You have roughly 24 hours before the federal indictments are unsealed." Maya stared at the man she had called her father, realizing the bridge was not merely burned. It had been atomized. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute hatred. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply gestured toward the open door, offering her the opportunity to walk out before security arrived to drag her away. Maya turned and fled the hospital room, abandoning her designer bag and the scattered fake transfer orders on the floor. She ran down the hallway, the sound of her frantic footsteps echoing the desperate, futile flight of a woman who had just realized she had engineered her own destruction. The final desperate maneuver had failed, accelerating her inevitable collision with the consequences of her crimes. 2 months passed. The sterile, quiet halls of the hospital were replaced by the towering, oak-paneled walls of a federal district courtroom. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady note, doing nothing to cut the stifling tension pressing down on the gallery. The trial of Patricia, Maya, and David was a spectacle of high society corruption. They were facing a federal indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted homicide. They sat at the defense tables, separated by their respective legal teams. The facade of the unified elite Kensington dynasty had shattered into a bitter, self-serving scramble for survival. Patricia wore a drab, oversized beige cardigan over a plain blouse, a stark departure from her usual designer wardrobe. She had spent the first 2 days of the trial sitting with her shoulders hunched, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, playing the role of a terrified, battered wife. Her defense attorney painted a picture of a woman trapped in a gilded cage. He claimed Richard was a tyrant who controlled her every move, driving her to a state of profound psychological distress. The defense argued that the poison was not a calculated murder plot, but the desperate, frantic act of a woman fearing for her own safety. Maya sat at the adjacent table, glaring at David. Her defense strategy was equally transparent. Her high-priced lawyer argued that Maya, as an adopted child, suffered from severe imposter syndrome. He claimed she was financially illiterate, a mere figurehead manipulated by David. The defense asserted that David orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme using Maya's name to open the offshore accounts without her understanding the true nature of the transactions. They pointed fingers. They wept on the stand. They spun elaborate emotional narratives designed to elicit sympathy from the jury. Then the federal prosecutor called me to the witness stand. I wore a tailored navy blue suit. My hair was pulled back into a severe, neat knot. I walked past the defense tables without sparing them a single glance. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took my seat. I adjusted the microphone. I did not feel nervous. A forensic auditor does not require emotion to testify. The numbers do all the heavy lifting. The prosecutor, a sharp man named Reynolds, established my credentials for the record. He noted my background in forensic accounting and my legal status as Richard's medical proxy. Then he dimmed the courtroom lights and activated the large projector screen facing the jury box. Ms. Kensington Prosecutor Reynolds began pacing slowly before the jury. The defense claims Patricia Kensington procured the toxin in a sudden, panicked state of distress. Does the financial data support this narrative? I directed my gaze to the screen. No, it does not, I stated, my voice echoing clear and crisp across the room. I clicked a remote in my hand. The screen displayed a detailed bank statement. This is a hidden checking account registered under Patricia's maiden name, I explained, utilizing a laser pointer to highlight specific transaction dates. 3 years ago, she opened this account using a post office box in a neighboring state. Over the last 14 months, she made a series of untraceable digital currency purchases. I tracked those transactions through a dark web proxy ledger directly to an overseas chemical supply vendor specializing in heavy metals. The jury members leaned forward, their eyes tracking the red laser dot. Patricia did not buy the thallium in a sudden panic. I continued presenting a timeline graph that overlaid her purchases with her husband's medical records. She purchased the toxin in small recurring increments. She initiated the first purchase exactly 2 weeks after Richard began a routine audit of the corporate pension fund. The dosage increased over 12 months, correlating precisely with his escalating neurological symptoms. This was a patient-calculated 12-month subscription to poison. Patricia stopped dabbing her eyes. The crumpled tissue dropped to the defense table. Her attorney stared at the screen, recognizing that the battered wife defense had just been eviscerated by a spreadsheet. Prosecutor Reynolds nodded, moving to the next item. And regarding the embezzlement, Ms. Kensington. Maya's defense claims she was ignorant of the financial mechanics, a victim of David's manipulation. What did your audit reveal? I clicked the remote. The screen shifted to display the incorporation documents for the 5 Cayman Islands shell companies. Maya's signature is on the founding documents, I stated. But signatures can be forged. Digital footprints cannot. I isolated the Internet protocol addresses used to access these offshore accounts. The logins did not originate from David's devices. They originated from a static IP address registered to Maya's personal residence and a dynamic IP address registered to her mobile phone. Maya gripped the edge of her table, her knuckles turning white. Furthermore, I clicked to the next slide displaying a complex authentication log. These offshore banking institutions require dual-factor authentication for all wire transfers exceeding $50,000. Every time a transfer moved from the Kensington Pension Fund into these shell accounts, a secure confirmation code was texted to a mobile device. I brought up a subpoenaed cellular phone record. The confirmation codes were sent directly to Maya's personal cellular number. I explained my tone clinical and relentless. She received the code, inputted it into the banking portal, and authorized the theft herself 84 separate times over 3 years. Ignorant figureheads do not bypass international banking security protocols on a weekly basis. I clicked to the final financial slide, and finally I tracked the outgoing expenditures from those offshore accounts. Maya did not hold the money in escrow. She spent it. I displayed a series of receipts: $600,000 in luxury real estate rentals in Paris, $200,000 in high-end jewelry purchases. An uneducated victim does not launder stolen pension funds through European fashion houses. Maya slumped back in her chair. The illusion of the manipulated adopted daughter shattered under the weight of the digital receipts. The defense attorney representing Maya stood up, attempting a desperate cross-examination. He approached the podium, his face flushed. "You expect this jury to believe these digital logs?" "Ms. Kensington." The attorney challenged, his voice loud and theatrical. "You are a disgruntled daughter-in-law. You have a documented history of animosity with my client. Is it not true that you possess the technical skills to fabricate these digital records to secure your own position within Richard's empire? Do you have any actual physical proof of a conspiracy, or just a pile of spreadsheets you curated yourself?" I looked at the defense attorney. I did not raise my voice to match his theatrics. I simply let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, ensuring the entire courtroom was focused on my response. "The digital evidence has been independently verified by the Federal Cybercrimes Division," I replied calmly. "But you are correct, counselor. Spreadsheets require context. Fortunately, I possess direct physical proof of their conspiracy." Prosecutor Reynolds stepped forward holding a flash drive. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce Exhibit F into evidence. The audio file recovered from the witness's mobile device recorded inside the intensive care unit on the night in question." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The courtroom fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The bailiff connected the drive to the courtroom audio system. A sharp hiss of static filled the room, followed immediately by the unmistakable panicked voice of David Kensington. "Pull the ventilator plug right now. The doctor's already said he is gone. This is what he would have wanted. Do not prolong his suffering for your sick power trip." The jury box reacted instantly. Several jurors widened their eyes, looking directly at David in his prison jumpsuit. David stared at the floor, refusing to look up. Then, Maya's voice blasted through the speakers, dripping with venom and aristocratic arrogance. "We are done playing nice. You are out of your depth, little girl. If you do not sign that paper right now, I will personally unleash the entire corporate legal team on you. We will ruin your career. We will bankrupt you." The audio continued, picking up the sound of my own voice, cold and unyielding. "If any of you dare to touch that machine, or if you attempt to enforce that fake injunction to pull the plug, I will immediately submit the heavy metal toxicology report to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The recording captured my next words with devastating clarity. "You did not account for a blood draw, did you, David? The doctors found the thallium. They found the lethal dose Patricia handed him at the Gala. They found the chronic poisoning you all orchestrated for the last 6 months. The most damning part of the recording was not the accusations. It was the reaction." The audio captured the sudden, breathless silence from Maya and David. There were no shouts of denial. There was no confusion. There was only the unmistakable, terrified silence of 2 guilty conspirators realizing their murder plot had been discovered. The recording ended with the sharp click of the stop button. The echo of their own voices lingered in the heavy oak rafters of the courtroom. The audio file decimated every single defense strategy in a matter of 2 minutes. It proved they knew about the poison. It proved they sought to pull the ventilator plug to silence the victim. It proved they acted as a unified, lethal syndicate. Maya's defense attorney stood at the podium, his mouth slightly open. He looked at his notes, looked at the jury, and slowly closed his legal pad. "I have no further questions for this witness," he muttered, retreating to his desk like a beaten man. I looked at the jury box. The 12 men and women were staring at the 3 defendants with unfiltered disgust. A woman in the front row crossed her arms tightly, shaking her head as she glared at Patricia. A man in the back row looked at Maya with an expression of pure revulsion. The empathy they had tried to manufacture with tears and beige cardigans was gone, replaced by the undeniable reality of their greed. I stepped down from the witness stand, my posture straight, my expression neutral. I walked back down the center aisle of the courtroom, leaving the 3 imposters to face the ruin they had engineered with their own hands. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sound block. The sharp, decisive crack echoed through the high ceilings of the federal district courtroom. It was the sound of an empire falling. The jury foreman had already read the verdict 10 minutes prior, pronouncing the defendants guilty on all counts. Now Judge Harrison looked down from the elevated bench, his expression offering zero leniency for the 3 individuals standing before him. Patricia stood between her public defenders. She had exhausted her hidden funds paying for initial legal fees, leaving her reliant on court-appointed representation for the sentencing phase. She trembled, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. The oversized beige cardigan she wore offered no protection against the reality of the moment. Patricia Kensington. Judge Harrison began, his voice amplified across the quiet room. "You engaged in a calculated, premeditated conspiracy to end your husband's life for financial gain. You weaponized a lethal toxin and attempted to mask your crime as a natural medical decline. For the charge of first-degree attempted murder and the accompanying charges of wire fraud, I sentence you to 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Patricia's knees gave out. Her lawyers caught her by the arms, hauling her back upright as she let out a hollow, ragged gasp. There would be no country club visits, no designer galas, no luxury vacations waiting for her. At 62 years old, a 20-year sentence was effectively a life sentence. She would draw her final breath behind concrete walls, stripped of the wealth she had traded her humanity to secure. The judge turned his focus to the adjacent table. Maya stood rigid, her jaw clenched tight, her eyes staring blankly straight ahead. Maya Kensington, the judge, continued reviewing the sentencing guidelines. "You abused your position of trust to embezzle millions of dollars from a family pension fund. You utilized complex offshore networks to launder stolen assets, and you actively conspired to accelerate a murder to conceal your theft. For the charges of federal embezzlement and money laundering, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." Maya did not collapse. She remained frozen, staring at the seal of the United States mounted on the wall above the judge's head. The reality of a decade and a half locked in a federal cage was crashing down upon her. The offshore accounts were gone, seized by the government to pay restitution to the Kensington Corporation. The designer wardrobe she used to intimidate others was worthless. She was a convicted felon with 0 assets. Finally, the judge directed his attention to my former husband. David looked pathetic. His tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The stress of the trial and the sudden evaporation of his false identity had hollowed him out. David Kensington, Judge Harrison stated, "Your involvement in this syndicate was driven by sheer greed. You accepted bribes to facilitate the theft of your father's retirement funds. However, due to your active cooperation with federal investigators regarding the timeline of the poisoning, the prosecution offered a plea agreement. I sentence you to 5 years of supervised probation." David let out a loud, pathetic sob of relief. He bowed his head, crying into his hands. He thought he had won. He thought avoiding a prison cell meant he had escaped the consequences. He was sorely mistaken. "But there are severe financial conditions to this leniency," the judge added, his tone growing sharper. "You are ordered to pay full restitution for the funds you received. Furthermore, I have been informed that Richard Kensington's legal team has successfully finalized your disinheritance and filed a subsequent civil judgment against you for damages. Your bank accounts are seized. Your wages will be garnished. You will leave this courtroom today a free man, but you carry a legal debt exceeding $2 million. David's relief died in his throat. He looked up, his eyes wide with horror, as the true nature of his punishment settled over him. A prison sentence provides a bed and 3 meals a day. David was walking out into the world with a negative net worth in the millions. He had no home as the luxury lease had been terminated. He had no trust fund. He had no job, and with a high-profile felony conviction on his record, no respectable corporate firm would ever hire him. The man who had mocked my working-class background was now destitute, destined to spend the rest of his life working minimum-wage jobs just to hand every paycheck over to the federal government. He was a ghost, crushed under a mountain of unpayable debt. "Court is adjourned," the judge announced, striking the gavel one final time. United States Marshals moved into the well of the courtroom. They carried heavy steel chains and standard-issue handcuffs. They approached Patricia first, pulling her arms behind her back. The metallic, ratcheting sound of the cuffs locking into place filled the quiet room. Patricia offered no resistance. She stared blankly at the floor, a broken woman facing the end of her life. The marshals then moved to Maya. As the cold steel clamped down on her wrists, the shock finally wore off. The reality of her sudden loss of power ignited a frantic, desperate rage. She twisted against the officers, her heels scraping against the polished wood floor. She scanned the gallery, her eyes darting past the reporters and the spectators until they locked onto me. I stood in the first row watching the procession with quiet observation. Maya lost her mind. The polished, aristocratic facade she had spent decades cultivating burned away, revealing the vicious, insecure fraud underneath. "This is your fault," Maya shrieked, her voice echoing shrill and chaotic across the oak-paneled room. "You planned this from the start. You ruined my family. You stole my father's mind. You are nothing but a cheap, low-class gold digger. You will never be one of us." The marshals grabbed her by the shoulders, attempting to force her toward the side exit, leading to the holding cells. Maya dug her heels in, fighting the officers, her face red and distorted with fury. She continued to hurl insults, spitting venom, trying to provoke a reaction from me. She wanted me to yell back. She wanted me to lose my composure so she could feel a fleeting sense of control over the narrative. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms. I stepped out of the gallery row and walked slowly toward the center aisle. I approached the restricted area where the marshals were struggling to subdue her. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Maya, maintaining a respectful distance from the federal officers, but close enough that she could see every detail of my calm, unbothered expression. The courtroom fell silent, watching the final confrontation. I looked at the woman who had poured wine on my dress. I looked at the woman who had tried to intimidate me in a hospital hallway while her adoptive father lay dying. I looked at the steel chains binding her wrists together. I leaned forward slightly. I did not shout for the gallery to hear. I pitched my voice low, creating a private, freezing channel of communication meant only for her ears. "You were always so obsessed with protecting the elite bloodline, Maya," I whispered, ensuring my enunciation was razor-sharp. "You spent your entire life pretending you were superior to everyone else in the room." Maya stopped struggling against the marshals. She stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with trapped, suffocating panic. She was forced to listen. "Congratulations on your new status." I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "Tomorrow morning you will trade your designer silk for a bright orange jumpsuit. You will trade your country club dinners for a plastic tray of boxed food. And you will sleep on a thin mattress bolted to an iron bed." I offered her a very small, precise smile. The same mocking smile she had given me at the charity gala right before she tried to ruin my life. "Enjoy your new life, Maya," I said softly, "because it is exactly what you deserve." I straightened my posture and took one step backward, yielding the floor to the federal agents. Maya stood paralyzed. The insults died in her throat. The realization that she was no longer a wealthy socialite, but merely an inmate number assigned to a federal cell block crashed down upon her. My quiet, factual description of her impending reality had severed the last string holding her ego together. The marshals pushed her forward. Maya did not fight them anymore. Her shoulders slumped, her head dropped. She walked toward the holding cell doors, a silent, defeated prisoner. I stood in the center aisle, watching the heavy doors swing shut behind them. I felt no lingering anger. The ledgers were balanced. The debts were paid. The silence in the courtroom was the sound of a toxic dynasty being permanently erased. The heavy glass doors of the federal courthouse pushed open, and I stepped out onto the wide granite plaza. The late afternoon sun broke through the overcast sky, casting a sharp, clean light across the city square. The air felt lighter, entirely scrubbed of the suffocating tension that had gripped the courtroom for the past 2 months. I adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase. The trial was over. The convictions were sealed. The only remaining task was administrative cleanup. I began descending the wide stone steps toward the curb, where a sleek, unmarked black sedan was idling. "Vanessa, wait." The voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with an ugly, desperate urgency. I paused on the second step from the bottom, turning slowly to observe the source of the noise. David Kensington stood 10 feet away. He had exited through a side door reserved for individuals avoiding the press. The man who had spent his entire life cloaked in the arrogance of inherited wealth now looked like a hollowed-out shell. His suit jacket was draped over his arm, his tie was missing, and the collar of his dress shirt was stained with sweat. He looked smaller, diminished by the crushing weight of the $2 million civil judgment hanging over his head. He closed the distance between us, moving with a frantic, jerky energy. He stopped just outside arm's reach, his eyes darting across my face, searching for a trace of the woman who had married him 3 years ago. He found only the forensic auditor who had engineered his ruin. "Vanessa, please," David choked out, his voice cracking. "You have to listen to me. I was manipulated. Patricia lied to me my entire life. Maya threatened me. I did not want any of this to happen. I am so sorry. I was wrong about everything." He took a half-step closer, lowering his head, attempting to adopt a posture of absolute submission. It was a pathetic, transparent performance. I was not apologizing for his actions. He was apologizing because he had been caught, and because he was currently staring down the barrel of a lifetime of crippling debt. He was hoping to leverage our marital history to secure a financial lifeline. "Please," David begged, his eyes wide and pleading. "Just give me one more chance. We can start over. I will do whatever you want. I will work any job. Just do not leave me with nothing." I looked at the man standing before me. I analyzed the trajectory of his existence. He was a coward who had happily watched his family humiliate me. I was a thief who had aided in the embezzlement of millions. He was an accomplice who had tried to physically force me to pull the plug on the man who raised him. And now, stripped of his power and his stolen identity, he was attempting to crawl back into my life under the guise of an apology. I did not feel anger. Anger implies a remaining emotional investment. I felt absolutely nothing. I reached into the front compartment of my leather briefcase. I bypassed the trial transcripts and the financial ledgers. I extracted a thick, crisp document bound by a blue legal spine. I did not hand the document to him. I tossed it lightly, letting the heavy paper strike him squarely in the center of his chest. David flinched instinctively, catching the document before it hit the pavement. He looked down at the bold, capitalized text across the cover page. It was a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. "Sign it," I instructed, my voice level carrying the chilling mechanical precision of a bank executing a foreclosure. David stared at the legal petition, his hands trembling. "But Vanessa, the assets," he stammered, his mind still programmed to negotiate for leverage. "The marital property. We have to divide that. There are no assets to divide, David." I cut him off, my tone flat and unyielding. "The luxury lease was in your name. The joint accounts were frozen. I am claiming 0 alimony, 0 spousal support, and 0 portion of the negative net worth you now possess." He looked up at me, confusion warring with panic. "You are not asking for anything." I looked at him with an expression of pure clinical detachment. "I am not taking a single cent from you, David, because you inherently possess 0 value." The words struck him with physical force. I did not scream at him. I did not list his betrayals or demand an explanation for his cruelty. I simply confirmed his absolute worthlessness. By refusing to engage in a messy, protracted divorce settlement, by refusing to demand financial compensation, I stripped him of his ability to play the victim. He could not claim I ruined him in the divorce. I was simply discarding him exactly as one discards an empty, useless vessel. "You are a biological fraud, a convicted felon, and a bankrupt coward," I stated, summarizing his existence in 3 factual bullet points. "Sign the papers and mail them to my attorney. If you attempt to contest the filing, I will ensure the proceedings are entirely public, and the press will receive the full transcript of your begging." David's mouth opened and closed. The last desperate hope of manipulation died in his eyes. He slowly lowered the divorce petition to his side, his posture collapsing inward. He looked down at his scuffed shoes, realizing he had truly been erased from the board. I did not wait for his response. The transaction was complete. I turned my back on him and descended the final 2 steps to the street level. The rear door of the idling black sedan opened from the inside. I slid into the leather passenger seat, placing my briefcase on the floorboard. Richard Kensington sat in the opposite seat. He wore a sharp charcoal pinstripe suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked significantly healthier than the man who had woken up in the intensive care unit 2 months prior. The thallium was gone from his system. The betrayal of his family was a closed chapter. He was once again the ruthless architect of a real estate empire, but the arrogance had been tempered by a quiet, calculating focus. He looked out the tinted window at the pathetic figure standing on the sidewalk. David had dropped to his knees on the pavement, clutching the divorce papers, staring blankly at the stone steps of the courthouse. Richard did not roll down the window. He did not offer a final word of condemnation to the man he had raised as a son. He simply observed the wreckage for 3 seconds, processing the total elimination of the fraud Patricia had built. Then Richard pressed the intercom button, connecting to the driver's compartment. "Take us back to the corporate headquarters." Thomas Richard instructed, his voice steady and commanding. "We have a board meeting to prepare for." The heavy engine of the sedan hummed to life. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the flow of city traffic. I looked out the window as we accelerated, watching the courthouse shrink in the rearview mirror. Neither of us turned our heads to look back at the broken man kneeling on the sidewalk. David Kensington had ceased to be relevant to the future of the empire. The past was effectively buried, and the ledgers were clear. It was time to focus on the assets that remained. Exactly 365 days have passed since the heavy wooden gavel struck the sound block in the federal courthouse, sealing the fate of the individuals who tried to destroy me. The passage of one single year can bring about profound seismic shifts in the architecture of a person's life. I am currently standing on the top floor of the corporate headquarters, looking out through the panoramic glass windows at the sprawling city skyline below. The morning sun reflects off the surrounding steel skyscrapers, casting a sharp, clean light across the surface of my desk. The penthouse executive suite no longer resembles a gilded, pretentious palace designed to impress shallow socialites. I ordered a rigorous renovation during my very first week in charge. I stripped away the heavy velvet curtains, the useless antique statues, and the expensive imported rugs the former heirs used to flaunt their stolen wealth. The space is now sleek, highly functional, and organized with clinical precision. I turn my back to this window and look toward the heavy oak door leading out to the executive reception area. A polished brass plate is securely mounted at eye level. The engraved letters catch the ambient light, displaying a title that the former family members believed was their exclusive birthright. The plate does not bear David's name. It does not bear Maya's name. It reads Vanessa Kensington, Chief Executive Officer. During the final stages of the divorce proceedings, Richard presented me with a unique legal proposition. He asked me to retain his family surname not as a lingering tether to my former husband, but as a formal public declaration of my legitimate succession. He wanted the global business sector to know that the corporate legacy was no longer associated with Patricia's fraud, Maya's embezzlement, or David's cowardice. The name now belongs to the forensic auditor who saved his life and rescued his empire from total financial ruin. The secure intercom on my desk chimes softly. My administrative assistant informs me that the executive board of directors is ready for the quarterly fiscal review. I pick up my digital tablet and a single leather-bound folder, stepping out of my office and walking down the wide corridor toward the primary conference room. I do not walk with the arrogant, entitled strut the former vice president used to employ. I walk with the measured, steady cadence of a woman who knows the exact location of every single dollar in the corporate ledger. I enter the boardroom. 12 senior directors sit around the long mahogany table. A year ago, these same individuals might have dismissed me as a mere outsider, a working-class in-law who did not belong in their elite financial circles. Today, they silence their side conversations the precise moment I cross the threshold. They sit up straight, opening their portfolios, offering me their undivided, unblinking attention. At the far end of the long table sits Richard, The severe heavy metal poisoning took a permanent toll on his physical stamina, forcing him to step back from the grueling daily operational grind, but his analytical mind remains sharp. He holds the title of Chairman Emeritus, serving solely in an advisory capacity. I take my designated seat at the head of the table. We begin the rigorous review of a proposed commercial acquisition. A newly promoted senior vice president, an ambitious hire attempting to prove his value to the board, presents a slick, highly colorful slideshow detailing a prospective commercial development project in the downtown sector. He highlights the projected revenue streams and the anticipated tenant occupancy rates. He finishes his presentation with a confident, eager smile, expecting immediate praise and rapid approval from the board. I do not smile. I look down at the tablet resting in front of me, bringing up the raw data files I extracted from the target company's public tax filings late last night. Your revenue projections are based on a heavily inflated assumption of the local zoning tax credits. I state my voice carrying a cool, undeniable authority that echoes across the quiet room. You failed to factor in the impending municipal levy adjustment scheduled for the upcoming fiscal quarter. Furthermore, the property management firm you listed as a primary partner carries a hidden liability structure that will severely drain our operational budget within 2 years. The acquisition is an unacceptable risk. We are passing on the deal. The senior vice president blinks rapidly, his sudden confidence evaporating as he scrambles to check his own notes. He realizes he missed a crucial, fatal detail that I uncovered in a matter of minutes. Richard leans back in his leather chair, a quiet, profound pride illuminating his weathered features. He nods in firm agreement, deferring entirely to my judgment. He knows the empire is secure because the person guarding the vault does not succumb to flashy presentations or empty charisma. She relies on empirical evidence. The board meeting concludes with unanimous approval of my revised fiscal strategy. I return to my office, taking a moment to appreciate the profound stillness of the environment. The stark contrast between my current reality and the bleak fate of the individuals who tried to bury me is a living testament to the unyielding power of factual data. Patricia is currently serving her 20-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary, stripped of her designer wardrobe and forced to navigate a harsh environment where her manipulative charms hold zero currency. Maya resides in a different federal cell block, trading her luxury European vacations for a rigid daily schedule and an unforgiving iron bunk. The elite bloodline she obsessed over provides no comfort behind thick concrete walls. When the federal authorities seized the offshore accounts, the stolen funds were returned to our corporate pension ledger. But Richard and I made a joint strategic decision regarding that specific capital. We matched the recovered $4 million with our own corporate funds to establish a specialized philanthropic grant program. We created a foundation dedicated to providing financial literacy and forensic accounting scholarships for young women from working-class backgrounds. The very individuals Maya would have looked down upon are now receiving elite educational funding, courtesy of the money she tried to steal. It is a poetic reallocation of assets. Every time a new scholarship is awarded, our media department generates a press release ensuring Maya can read about her unintentional philanthropy from the confines of her prison library. And David, the man who demanded I sign away my power in a hospital hallway, is a ghost haunting the fringes of the city. To satisfy the crippling civil judgments levied against him, the state garnishes nearly every dollar he earns. He works grueling night shifts doing manual inventory at a regional shipping warehouse, entirely invisible to the high society circles he once dominated. He possesses no assets, no influence, and no future. I used his own inherent lack of value to construct his prison, ensuring he can never portray himself as a victim. He simply faded into the poverty he once mocked. I step back toward the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling metropolis that I now help shape and develop. The journey from a dismissed, unvalued relative to the reigning executive of a billionaire dynasty did not require ruthless deception or illegal maneuvering. It required patience and unblinking focus on the truth and the iron discipline to let arrogant people dig their own graves. Society dictates that blood is the most vital bond a human being can possess. They tell you that family requires unconditional loyalty, that you must tolerate disrespect and mistreatment simply because you share a genetic code or a legal surname with your abusers. They demand that you keep the peace, swallow your pride, and maintain the fragile illusion of a happy, unified household. But sometimes the individuals sharing your bloodline or your dinner table are the very first ones willing to push you off a cliff to secure their own comfort. They will label you an outsider. They will mock your background. They will attempt to convince you that you are fundamentally unworthy of a seat at their table. Do not ever shrink your ambitions or your intellect to fit into a family structure that refuses to recognize your inherent value. If you are sitting at a gathering right now biting your tongue while your relatives make subtle cutting remarks about your clothes, your career, or your family background, stop. You do not owe your silence to individuals who refuse to respect your voice. When they insult you, do not waste your breath engaging in a loud screaming match. When they try to intimidate you, do not grant them the satisfaction of your tears. Use your silence to observe their critical weaknesses. Use your isolation to gather your hard evidence. Build your fortress out of undeniable facts, secure your perimeter, and let them underestimate you. Let them believe they hold the power right up until the exact moment you present the receipts. Use your ultimate undeniable success as the final lethal punishment. The best revenge is not a heated confrontation in a crowded hallway. The best revenge is watching the individuals who tried to bury you realize that they merely planted a seed. My name is Vanessa. They told me I would never fit into their elite family. They were right. I did not fit in. I took over. I transformed their cruel insults and their toxic greed into their own irrevocable death sentence. The sun is beginning to set over the skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my mahogany desk. I often think about the woman who stood in that freezing hospital corridor, clutching a damp cardboard box, surrounded by people who wanted her erased. If I could hand her a blueprint back then, or hand one to anyone currently trapped in a dynamic designed to break them, it would consist of 3 fundamental principles. First, biology is a genetic coincidence, not a lifelong debt. Society conditions us to believe that family requires infinite forgiveness, that sharing a surname means you must tolerate disrespect, manipulation, or outright betrayal. Erase that conditioning. Respect is a transactional currency. If the individuals at your dinner table are bankrupt in how they treat you, you owe them zero loyalty. You have the fundamental right to close the ledger and walk away from any relationship that demands your subjugation as the price of admission. Second, never engage in a screaming match with a manipulator. When a toxic individual attacks your character, your natural instinct is to defend yourself, to raise your voice, to plead for them to acknowledge the truth. Suppress that instinct. They feed on your emotional reaction because it validates their control. Instead, weaponize your silence. Retreat, observe, and gather your data. Whether it is a bank statement, a cruel text message, or a forged document, collect the receipts. A loud argument merely fades into a dispute of opinions. Hard evidence presented at the exact right moment is an undeniable execution. Third true victory is not witnessing your enemies suffer. True victory is their irrelevance to your future. Maya sits in a prison cell, and David lives in the shadows, but my satisfaction does not stem from their ruin. It comes from the empire I manage, the philanthropic scholarships we fund, and the profound peace I experience every time I lock my office door. The most devastating punishment you can inflict upon those who tried to bury you is to build a thriving, untouchable life on the very ground they attempted to destroy. If you are listening to this and you feel trapped by the expectations of a toxic bloodline, know that you hold the authority to change the narrative. You can audit your own life, cut the liabilities, secure your assets, and redefine your worth on your own terms. Thank you for sharing your time with me today. If my journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to quietly gather your own evidence to survive a hostile environment, leave a comment below and share your experience. I read every single one. For more narratives about reclaiming your power, shattering illusions, and drawing unyielding boundaries, make sure to subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Remember, you never have to shrink to fit into their world. You can always build your own.